Maisie Senior Fellow at our sister institution, CSAC, out at Stanford, which is part of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. He's also faculty director of CSAC's program on geopolitics, technology, and governance, as well as a professor of political science by courtesy. From April 2021 to July 2023, Colin served as the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the U.S. Department of Defense. In that role, he was the principal advisor to the Secretary of Defense for all matters related to national security and defense policy, and represented the department as a standing member of the National Security Council's deputies meeting. He basically oversaw everything the department was doing at this time on the policy side, from the national defense strategy.
Only the good stuff.
Only the good stuff, yeah. From the national defense strategy to AUKUS, I won't go through everything, but as a result of his service in June of 2023, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin awarded him the Department of Defense Distinguished Public Service Medal, which is the highest civilian award presented by the Secretary of Defense. This was not Colin's first experience in government. During the Obama administration, he served as Deputy Assistant to President Obama and National Security Advisor to then Vice President Biden from October of 2014 to January of 2017. And previous to that, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East from February of 2009 to December of 2011, for which he received the Outstanding Public Service Medal. Beyond all of that, he's the author of many books, most recently co-author with Tom Wright, Aftershocks, Pandemic Politics, and the End of the Old International Order. He previously taught at Georgetown and the University of Minnesota and has held fellowships at Harvard, CFR CNAS, and the Penn Biden Center. So, Colin, welcome.
It's great to be with you.
Well, this is a little different than our typical Wednesday seminar, in that it'll be more of a conversation. So I'm going to kick things off with a few questions for Colin, focusing primarily on kind of the contemporary international security landscape. Then we'll throw it open to all of you, and I know you all have many questions, being inquisitive members of the MIT SSP community, and really there's sort of no place, I think, we won't be able to go in the conversation. But before kind of getting to the international security landscape, I just wanted to ask Colin to talk a little bit about his sort of journey from teaching at the University of Minnesota to becoming sort of Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. We have a lot of students, right, who are interested in how academic careers intersect with policy careers, or how one might transition from an academic career to a policy career. So it'd be just great to hear a little bit about how you ended up where you were.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's great to see so many friendly faces and to be here. Thanks, too, for providing the glorious weather.
It's not snowing.
No, it's perfectly fine. Look, I think in a lot of ways, my professional career has been a bit defined by a series of kind of inflection points that we've all experienced collectively, well, at least those of us who are old enough, since the end of the Cold War. You know, I started college the year after the Berlin Wall fell. So at the dawning of the post-Cold War era. I wrote my dissertation when security studies was trying to figure out what it meant to do security studies after the Cold War. So I wrote my dissertation on the causes of civil and ethnic conflict in developing countries. This was in the 90s. So think of like the Bob Kaplan coming anarchy debates and things like that. Then I got my PhD at Columbia University. I worked with Bob Jervis and Jack Snyder and Dick Betts and some other luminaries. I got my first teaching job at the University of Minnesota. I started in the fall of 2000, and then a year later, 9/11 happened. And obviously, 9/11 had a searing event on most Americans. Those who had a connection to New York, I think, felt an even more kind of jarring psychological moment. And for me, I think it convinced me that I didn't want to just be an academic, not because there's anything wrong about being an academic, but like not unlike other people felt a call to service. Some people, left college and joined the Marines, and other people went into federal service. And I wanted to figure out a way to contribute to the conversation at a time where I thought we needed, it was kind of an all hands on deck moment. So in 2004, I applied for the Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellowship, which I think, as many of you know, is kind of an embedded nerd program where they take at the time they took assistant professors. Now I think they also have program for tenured professors, and they put you in a policy setting for a year or so. And so in 2005, and it turned out to be 18 months, I was placed at the Pentagon. Now, I'm obviously a Democrat. I've been a political appointee in a couple of Democratic administrations, but this was like at the height of the George W. Bush era. Don Rumsfeld was still the Secretary of Defense. Doug Feith, one of the Iraq War architects, had the job that I would later have as he was the Undersecretary for Policy, and it was kind of in a social science way. It was kind of a hard case in the sense that, like, if I could enjoy public service and find value in it, even in that context, then it showed that it was extraordinarily valuable. And what it really did teach me was that you can have an incredibly rewarding experience and do things that you value and that you think can produce change, even working for administration that you have fundamental disagreements with. So I was working on issues like the reform of U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine. This was in the year preceding the surge in Iraq, and a bunch of other issues related to that. I then I kind of caught the Washington D.C. bug. So I transferred from Minnesota to take a job at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and then I did the DC thing, which is to not just have one job, but have like 5 jobs.
Right.
And so I was an assistant professor at Georgetown, where they were kind enough to give me tenure to associate professor. I then also had a senior fellowship at a think tank called the Center for New American Security, where a bunch of folks who ended up being very senior in the Obama administration went in, and I was working on the Obama campaign as an informal advisor. And so when Obama won, and my boss at CNIS, Michelle Flournoy, became the Undersecretary for Policy at the Defense Department, she asked me to run the Middle East office because all my research had been on contemporary U.S. defense policy, especially in Iraq, but in some other places as well. So I did that for 3 years at the beginning of the Obama administration, and it was kind of off to the races since then. So I've kind of been back and forth between the academy and public service ever since. I served at the White House for the last 2.5 years as Vice President Biden's national security advisor, and I continued to advise him during the first Trump administration. And so when he won the presidency, and I had been on the transition team, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with the interim national security strategic guidance, but it was like the initial kind of a national security strategy light that came out at the beginning of the Biden administration. I wrote that document during the transition, and so he asked me to help work with Lloyd Austin and Kath Hicks at the Defense Department. The last thing I will just say, for those who don't have any idea as to what the Undersecretary of Defense for Policy is, there's a dispute about whether it's technically the number 3 civilian position or not at the Department of Defense. It kind of depends. If you're actually thinking about like how many people would have to die before you were the Secretary of Defense, you're not the number 3 person. But you are the most senior official that deals with policy matters and foreign policy and national security issues below the Secretary of Defense, because the Deputy Secretary largely is a kind of an inside game job, and the Undersecretary is the outside game. And so you are essentially the national security advisor of the Secretary of Defense, and you run a core staff of about 800 folks, and then about 2,000 other people who report to you from agencies. It's a budget of about $700 million, which is very small by Pentagon standards, but big by normal standards. And it's a fascinating job, and I got to be there for some pretty big developments in modern history, contemporary history, the evacuation from Afghanistan, the invasion of Ukraine, China's high altitude balloons. I was not there when Gaza happened, so maybe I can say we were winning when I left. But a lot of interesting things.
So just real quick on the Undersecretary role. I know there's probably no typical day, but what would close to sort of a day in the life be for someone in that position?
Yeah. So I think you're trying to balance a couple of things. Like, the first is kind of doing the day-to-day crisis management of the building. And they're always there are a lot of them now, but there have always been a lot. And so a big portion of your day is going to be consumed with meetings around whatever the hot button issue is. And a lot of those meetings are going to happen at the White House in the Situation Room or around the Deputies Committee table. So that's always going to be a portion of your day. Then a portion of your day is going to be hopefully dealing with like the big policy and strategic decisions in the department. So you're doing briefings where you're overseeing combatant commands coming in to brief their contingency plan, the latest draft of the contingency plan on North Korea or Iran or China or Russia or whatever before it goes to the secretary, or you're overseeing the writing of the national defense strategy or some other big policy rock. And then, of course, there's a chunk of the day that's just about like doing your homework, like clearing memos and sending back edits to staff and everything else. So
Grading.
basically, no joke. So, I mean, my alarm went off at 5 o'clock in the morning every day, sometimes 4:30 in the morning. I would try to have coffee, read some news, and do some exercise in the morning, and then my car would pick me up and take me to work. I'd get in the morning around 7:30, spend about 90 minutes reading the presidential daily brief and the other intel stuff, and catching up on the classified email and everything else. And then from about 8:30 in the morning until say 5 or 5:30, there would just be a series of meetings where your staff schedules you in increasingly diminishing increments, somewhere between 15 minutes and an hour. And then at 5 o'clock we would do the daily wrap meeting in my office, which makes it sound like you're about to go home, except that's when they come in and they give you the pile of homework. And that's what of what you have to clear and either send back into the kitchen to get cooked some more, or send up to the secretary. And then so about 8 o'clock at night I would wander home. That'd be a typical day.
Sounds exhausting.
It's great.
It's great.
It's really renewing.
It's really invigorating.
Yeah.
So you mentioned some of the elements of sort of the current international security landscape that you experienced. It seems like since you left, the rate of change in the international security environment is sort of evolving sort of exponentially. So how do you see kind of the current landscape? Where do you see it going?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about this at any level of granularity, but because I've been trained at least as an academic, I do actually think we're undergoing some important moments of pretty big structural changes, frankly. And that a lot of what we're seeing is the surface layer manifestation of some deeper changes in the international system. And there are lots of different ways you could slice this. So my way is just my way. I'm sure there's smarter folks in the room who think about it differently. But I kind of think about the contemporary security challenges as kind of having three layers. And these are not mutually exclusive, and the boundaries between them are super fuzzy. But one layer is just the geopolitical layer. And that is that geopolitics is back with a vengeance. And it's not just that they're kind of the old school realist competition of countries for power and security, but it's increasingly a competition of coalitions. So the distribution of power has changed. The United States remains the most powerful actor, but the margin of difference between us and China is diminishing, and there are other important actors in the world, not the least of which being Russia, which, unlike China, can't dominate the world but can blow up the world. And I think what you've seen, the biggest change, I think, in the last couple of years, even since we've wrote the national defense strategy, it's not that competitors and adversaries and rivals, the Chinas, Russias, North Koreas, and Irans of the world are challenging the United States. That's not a new story. That they've been challenging and counterbalancing what they perceive to be U.S. hegemony or unipolarity for a couple of decades. What is different is the qualitative alignment among those countries. And I think that is in part a consequence of the changing balance of power, but I think it is in large part a consequence of the war in Ukraine, which has treated the Russians to the point that they are extraordinarily dependent on the other pieces of what some people call the axis of upheaval. I prefer the Legion of Doom, but whatever you call it. The Russians are dependent on the North Koreans for missiles and artillery. They're reliant on the Iranians for drones and drone manufacturing capability. They're relying on the Chinese for dual use commercial products and other things that support the Russian industrial base, not to mention to help the Russians evade sanctions and get other economic relief like subsidized oil. And in return, the Russians are helping to level up all those other actors in terms of their military capabilities. So I think that tightening alignment among this kind of axis of revisionist authoritarian powers is real. And that has real consequences for everything from how we think about our defense budget to how we think about war planning to how we think about the international security environment. And I think for a long time we've dreamed about peeling these countries off from one another, and I think that is increasingly implausible. So that's the bad guys are increasingly getting together, and on the other side stands the United States and kind of our core treaty allies, and then a handful of democratic partners that constitute what Joe Biden kind of in an old-fashioned way referred to as the free world. And then you have a huge swath of the globe that actually doesn't want to be on anybody's team, the kind of the middle powers and swing states of the global south that are hedging and playing both sides off the other. And some of those are have a lot of resources to bring to bear. The Saudi Arabias and United Arab Emirates of the world, India, or large emerging countries like Brazil or Indonesia or whatever. So it's a very dynamic geopolitical world. So that's the geopolitical layer. I think you have an externalities layer, which is if you think about all the actors that are interacting with one another economically and in the security domain, what are the second and third order consequences from those interactions that none of them intended, but we still have to deal with, right? And so think about climate change or pandemics or the misinformation and disinformation that flows through the internet, or think about irregular migration that flows from various changes. So these are the negative externalities of the interactions among actors in the international system that have profound consequences for our security in a very direct and huge way. And I have two young kids, so I think a lot about the climate that they will live in moving forward. And 2024 is the hottest year of the century. The second hottest was 2023. We've all heard this term, like this year is the hottest year of the century, right? That is the exact wrong way to think about it. This year is the coldest year for the rest of this century. All right, so we are going to live in a warming world that is more competitive, with less biodiversity, with more competition for resources. It's going to have profound security implications, and then we all lived through COVID. And so there's like this externalities layer. And of course, the geopolitical layer and the externalities layer have negative synergies between one another, because the externalities layer, in theory, requires a lot of cooperation to solve, and the geopolitical dynamics make that cooperation more difficult. And then the last layer is what I would call the techno-political layer, and that is that I don't think you can understand either the geopolitical or externalities layer without understanding the revolutionary technologies that are changing everything. How power is exercised, how we live our lives. So think cyber, space, artificial intelligence and autonomy, robotics, biotechnology, and clean energy would be the technologies that I would call forward. A lot of the expertise on those issues are right here at MIT. That is the expertise that isn't resident at Stanford. These technologies are literally changing the foundations of power and how we live our lives. But it's not just that. It's also the innovation and advances at the frontier that are shaping the balance of power, and whether we solve or make worse these externalities are almost entirely concentrated in the private sector. And these private sector actors are geopolitical actors in their own right. Some of these companies are $2 or $3 trillion companies with the GDPs of a G20 country. They have global presence, and something that is rather unique, I think, in human history, they have almost near sovereign control over many of the domains through which we live our lives. So think about the role of private space companies. Half the satellites in low Earth orbit are owned by Elon Musk. Half. Think about cloud service providers, cloud compute and service providers. Think about social media platforms. These are all under-regulated spaces that are inherently transnational and shape everything about how we understand the world and interact in the world, and they're beyond the control of most states, right? And so one of the things that struck me, as one of the things that we know the least about as political scientists is, how do we think about the contemporary corporate actors as international actors in their own right? We don't have good theories about that, and we probably need some. So that's a long way of saying I think we have these broad layers, and so all this stuff that we're that we see, whether it's in Ukraine or in Gaza or in Syria or across the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea. I think a lot of that is essentially the byproduct of some of these deeper changes that are going on.
Excellent. So going back to your first point about geopolitics, the term I heard recently in the UK was CRINKS, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, which I thought was a useful acronym. So we can add that to the Legion of Doom and Axis of the CRINKS. So I like how you focus on the war, maybe consolidating that alignment more. it looks as if we could have a ceasefire or armistice or something in Ukraine in the next 12 months, or if we did, how do you think that would in turn sort of shape the relations among those that group of states?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I will make a prediction, which is that I think we're actually going to see a significant de-escalation in both the Middle East and in Ukraine in 2025, and I think it's basically for two reasons. One, because we are at the point of exhaustion in or culmination, I would say, in across these theaters. And so this would be the point that all else being equal, we would expect something to happen, either something to peter out or some type of deal. And the other is that I think that, Trump has come into office uh, wanting to end these things and not being particularly concerned with those ends being particularly just or sustainable. And so the deals are a lot easier to get if you don't really care if they're just, and if you really aren't thinking about their medium to long-term viability. And so I think those two things together, the kind of the exhaustion of the system and Trump not giving a crap about the justice or sustainability of these deals, means that we're likely to get some de-escalation across the board. In Ukraine, look, I think that a lot of it depends on the nature of the deal, but there's a lot of skepticism about whether Putin is actually willing to sit down. Some people would say, like, he's winning. Why would he sit down? I think the short answer to that is he's winning, but at the cost of 12 to 1,500 men being killed or wounded a day, which is extraordinary. The cost to the Russian economy remain significant, and there are things that he wants. He would like to get Kursk back. He would like to guarantee that Ukraine is not in NATO. These are things that I think Trump might be able to deliver for him. And so I can imagine essentially an armistice along the current lines that has a bunch of commitments that the United States makes. No Ukraine in NATO, no U.S. troops or not significant troops inside Ukraine, no long-range U.S. systems inside Ukraine, and in exchange, the war kind of peters out, and most of the security responsibility for Ukraine is shifted to the Europeans. What would that mean for the broader dynamics? I think that I don't think that it's likely to loosen the connectivity between the axis of upheaval. I think that Russia is going to remain highly dependent on China and North Korea and Iran for their defense industrial base and their economy. And I also don't think that you can, even a wind down in Ukraine ends the tensions with the United States. So the kind of counterbalancing motivations that these actors have. So I don't know that it's going to fundamentally loosen. If there's one place where you might get some loosening is if you can drive a wedge between Russia and China on North Korea, because I think there is some competition between the two actors in that score. But I don't actually think you're going to see a fundamental loosening. I do think where the cracks are likely to be most manifest are within the Free World Coalition, where I don't predict that Trump's going to pull out of NATO or that their alliances are going to be destroyed. I think a lot of our allies have learned how to deal with Trump and give him enough to keep the alliances intact. And our allies don't really have other places to go. So I think that they will probably try to wait Trump out but I do think that you're going to see a lot more acrimony and disagreement and a lot less solidarity within between the United States and our core treaty allies. And I think that's especially true in Europe, because I don't think it's a secret to say, like, Trump just doesn't like the Europeans. I mean, he doesn't like our allies, period. He thinks all American allies are free riders on American security commitments, and that they then cash in to their economic benefit. But he has a unique dislike of the Europeans that I think is likely to play out, and we should expect autocrats like Putin to play on.
Great. I mean, one thing I was thinking about was China, because part of China's approach to the United States has been to try to sort of drive a wedge between Europe and the United States. China's support for Russia and Ukraine, completely sort of undermine that goal. So one thing I've been thinking about is, would there be some loosening whereby China is going to try to sort of return to Europe, perhaps in a different way, but also perhaps draw upon some of the dissatisfaction or frustration or whatever it might be that allies will have with the incoming administration, such that sort of 4 years from now, perhaps China's position itself a bit differently inside what you call the free world than where they are today.
Yeah, I think you're right, that the Chinese are going to try. I think we should expect a significant charm offensive in 2025 between Beijing and Europe, and I also think with some other countries like India too. I do think that they will probably try to take advantage of whatever turbulence they envision that Trump may create within our alliance and partnership networks to look for soft spots. And Europe is the place where they may perceive they can make the most gains because of Europe's economic reliance on China, and therefore there's a lot of cards to play. A couple of things I do think will cut in the opposite direction. One is the point that you made that the Europeans, I think, have a much more negative view of China as a consequence. In the first instance of COVID and the wolf warrior diplomacy that accompanied that, followed by Beijing's support for what Putin did in Ukraine, which I think has really put a sour taste. Now, I don't think most Europeans are signed up for the holistic, full-fledged muscular competition that Washington has been pushing them towards, but I think they have a more negative view. I also think that the Ukraine conflict was a lesson for Europe in a different regard, which is the dangers of being overly dependent on potentially aggressive, revisionist, authoritarian countries. And so I do think they worry about overdependence on China for certain critical supply chain, whether it's electric vehicles or critical minerals and rare earths or other things. So I don't think that they're going to completely make up. I also think that the Trump folks will likely throw some elbows at Europe if they make up too much, and Europe will have to watch out for that. I mean, keep in mind, a lot of European countries started to harden their positions on Huawei, even at the height of their disagreements with Trump, because I think some of them came to see the security issues in a similar way, but B, there was a certain degree of kind of coercive transactionalism that affected their policies too. So I think we will see Beijing try. I think it'll probably slow the balancing of Europe against China, but not stop it. But we'll have to see. I don't see it having a huge effect on the core balancing logic in the Indo-Pacific, though, because I think a lot of that is mostly about those countries reacting to their own judgments about China's threat to their sovereignty and their territorial claims. So, I don't know how much China and India can make up without some concessions along their disputed border, which I don't really see the Chinese being willing to make. Although you would know this issue better than me. The PRC has been extraordinary at pushing the Philippines in our direction, even at the end of the Duterte government, and I don't really see that changing now. Japan, I think, has made a hard turn. The one place where you might see the possibility for inroads in the Indo-Pacific is South Korea, especially in the aftermath of because Yoon has been very hawkish on China. Right. And much more willing to talk about China as a national security issue separate and apart from North Korea. And it strikes me that the opposition is probably not in the same place. So that would be the place I would watch among our major allies.
No, I think the Korean Peninsula, South Korean Peninsula, is the most fascinating place to watch U.S.-China dynamics play out in Asia. I mean, it's really interesting. Sticking with Europe for a minute, though, and Ukraine, what are the lessons in your mind for sort of nuclear deterrence, nuclear coercion, and escalation management that come out of sort of our experience with that conflict?
I think that the lessons are nuclear weapons are incredibly salient for contemporary conflict, and we thought that they weren't. And yet they're a pretty blunt instrument that are hard to wield in a way that generates effects. So I think that we could go into whatever detail you want. A lot of this has been reported and talked about in books like the Woodward book and other things. But I think since from the very beginning, Russia compensated for their conventional weakness and overinvestment vis-a-vis NATO and the United States by brandishing nuclear threats. At the very outset of the invasion of Ukraine, Putin put a number of nuclear threats on the table. And I think there his main concern was that with 90% of the Russian army inside Ukraine, there might be opportunistic aggression along his frontier by other actors. And so he wanted to let people know that he had other ways to protect himself. But he didn't really change fundamentally their alert status or the delegation around these weapons or other things that made us super nervous. The only time where we got extraordinarily nervous was in the fall of 2022, and this has been reported when the intelligence community told President Biden that if the Ukrainians broke through in the south, they judged that the risk of Russia using a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine had gone from 5% to 50%. So a coin flip, which is, if somebody briefs you on that in the presidential daily brief, and especially if it's the same intelligence community that turned out knew a lot about what the Russians were doing before the war, that would get your attention. And there are a bunch of reasons for that, not the least of which being that the Russian army had just imploded in the north around Kharkiv, and I think they were very worried a similar circumstance was going to happen in the south, and that the Ukrainians would then drop. That the two things would happen: the Russian army would collapse, which could have all sorts of implications for the Russian regime, kind of a 1917 scenario that we know Putin worries about, and also that the Ukrainians might drive on Crimea. And so, as crazy as it sounds, that's a narrow band of scenarios where the battlefield use of nuclear weapons in extremis to kind of like stop
Right.
the Ukrainians in their tracks was, something that we had to worry about. That didn't come to pass in large part, I think, because the U.S. sent some pretty strong deterrence messaging, both directly to the Russians, but also indirectly via the Indians and the Chinese and the Turks and the Saudis and the Israelis, but also because the Ukrainians didn't break through the lines in the south at the time of maximum vulnerability for the Russians. So I think the moment kind of passed. So, I haven't been in the administration for a year, but I don't judge that anything that's happened then has kind of put Putin in the corner in quite the way where his threats have therefore been credible. So he keeps making them. But essentially, these huge nonlinear escalation threats don't appear to be terribly effective in response to the kind of salami slicing you've seen or the boiling of frog, pick your analogy, that you've seen the West engage, this weapon system, then this weapon system, then this loosening of engagement, then this loosening of engagement, where no one pushing past a pink line or a red line seemed to justify an extraordinary and existential choice. So I think we've gotten in, I don't judge the risk of nuclear escalation to be super high unless there was a fundamental change on the battlefield or, a bunch of strategic sites in Russia were hit or something else. So I think it proves that you can't. I don't subscribe to the view that like it's been bluster and bluffing from the very beginning and nuclear weapons don't matter at all. Of course they matter. They did affect how the United States thought about the conflict, just like they affected how we thought about conflicts with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. The stability instability paradox is not a new thing. It's like where the threshold is and how you navigate it. We had to relearn a lot of that stuff, and we had to relearn it with an adversary in the Russians that had a lower threshold for nuclear use than the Soviets did, because the conventional imbalance was flipped relative to the Cold War. So of course we paid attention to that. People say like basically we're a bunch of chickens who weren't willing to take the risks for Ukraine to win because because Putin was always bluffing. I don't believe that, but I also am convinced that the utility of these of nuclear weapons is still pretty small. The last point I will make is a lot has been made about how the United States has been deterred by Russian nukes during this conflict, and I think there are some ways in which that is true. But I would also remind folks that Russia has been deterred by our nuclear weapons every single day. The Russians know exactly where all the bases are in Europe, where the weapons flow through, and where the intelligence is provided. And like they're stationary targets on a map. They could hit them any day of the week. They don't do it because they're deterred by us. And so I think that if I'm sitting in Beijing, I might take the lesson from Ukraine that there's a degree of a nuclear overhang that might deter certain aspects of direct U.S. interventions in certain scenarios, but would also raise some pretty fundamental questions in terms of Beijing. Is like, are they going to sink American ships? Are they going to bomb American bases? Because like that's a big piece of business. And history is literally littered with great powers that are no longer great powers because they sunk an American ship, right? So is the equivalent of not hitting a base in Poland not hitting an American aircraft carrier because, like, so I think the nuclear stuff is going to cut both ways, but typically because people like to spin out the narrative that the Biden administration was weak in the face of these threats, they don't actually think about how the other side was also deterred from doing a bunch of things they might otherwise have done.
I guess it raises the question, though, God forbid, the worst sort of scenario, right, of a major U.S.-China clash, probably over Taiwan, right? The U.S. might be tempted to use nuclear weapons in a limited way. Some people going into this new administration have written about that. And would the U.S. also be deterred such that, right, China would be able to leverage its conventional sort of home field advantages that, right, the U.S. sort of structurally has to struggle against in that part of the Pacific?
Yeah, I'm not going to. I think a lot of it completely depends on the. I mean, this. It completely depends on the scenario that we're talking about, right? Are we talking about a slow squeeze blockade scenario? That's one version of this. Are we talking about a lightning, a joint firepower strike followed by a lightning amphibious invasion? Are we talking about that then actually doesn't work and so it bleeds into a protracted conflict? Are we talking about a kind of Pearl Harbor bolt out of the blue? Like, I think the risks of nuclear escalation are actually meaningfully different in all of those cases. My own view is that the most likely scenario that we get a nuclear war is you get a failure of conventional deterrence. So that we're not going to. I don't think we stumble into a nuclear war with China without a protracted conventional war fight that's beforehand. And so the number one thing we have to do is deter the Chinese from doing it to begin with. But I actually don't think we have to deter them by convincing them they're going to lose. I think we deter them by convincing them it will be hard, which is different. I think if Xi Jinping believes he can take Taiwan in a week or two, and that the world will kind of react the way that the world reacted to Hong Kong, which is to shame on you, and then went right back to doing business, they're much more likely to do it. If they believe that it's going to be closer to 1 or 2 years, not 1 or 2 weeks, and that there will be real hell to pay economically, if for no other reason, just because of the politics of how this would play out in the United States, and that a protracted conflict would wreak havoc on the supply chains that also impact China's economy, then I don't think he'll do it. Because I don't think he. Why would he? I mean, that makes the minute he does this is rolling. This is rolling all the dice as it relates to the regime. So, and I think we have a huge opportunity to convince him that it won't be easy, and that there are ways for Taiwan to hold on to be resilient, and there are ways for the United States to fight the war at a level of effectiveness that can keep the threshold sufficiently below the nuclear threshold, but be quite effective. And I think one of the reasons why you've seen so much emphasis in the Pentagon on the replicator initiative is precisely for this reason, which is thousands and thousands of relatively low cost, attritable, semi-autonomous and autonomous munitions that can wreak havoc on any force that's trying to get across the strait. And by the way, they don't have to get across the strait once. They have to get across the strait every single day to resupply and put more folks on the beach and keep their lodgement in place. And I think what we've seen in Ukraine is that there is such a thing as precise mass, that you can have very large numbers of relatively inexpensive loitering munitions and sensors, and that it becomes very difficult to mass and move without getting killed. And I think there's all sorts of opportunities for that for the defense. I mean, the Taiwans have to do some stuff differently.
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah.
But, yes.
Anyway, it's just to say, I think that the lessons of Ukraine net out to putting some additional years on the clock as it relates to Taiwan. But I don't think it's walked Xi Jinping off the target. I think we still have to put, like every year, we have to put more years on the clock. But anyway.
Okay, I could go on China, but I won't. But I want to go back to the Middle East for a minute before turning it over to the audience. But a lot has happened since you left the Pentagon.
I said earlier we were winning when I left. That's not true, actually. But we are losing worse now. Yeah.
I mean, I did not have Syria falling on my bingo card
No,
last
I
month.
didn't have Assad falling or martial law in South Korea
Yeah,
in my transition
yeah,
bingo card. Neither one.
no.
Yeah. The world's complicated.
So I guess this will be very broad, open-ended questions, but like, what do you see as kind of the short to medium term future of that region, given the war in Gaza,
Yeah.
the war with Hezbollah, or now ceasefire, collapse of Assad? Iran obviously is going to loom large, probably for the incoming administration, based on how they behaved,
Yeah.
in the previous one. So, like, how do you sort of view the dynamics evolving here? Obviously, I know it's too soon to tell, because Syria doesn't have is standing up a government and everything else. But like, just what are sort of your first impressions of
Yeah.
where this might be headed?
Yeah. So Syria could go in a million different directions. It could evolve into a relatively stable federated equilibrium. It could descend into anarchy along the lines of Libya or post-Saddam Iraq or Sudan or other places. Like there's lots of, but I think zooming out to look at the broader geopolitical environment, I think we're actually at a pretty recognizable inflection point. And that is because, obviously the events of October 7th were horrendous and barbaric. The war in Gaza and its aftermath and the humanitarian calamity that has ensued, like we're all on college campuses, we understand how controversial and searing that was. But um, if you distance yourself from the humanitarian piece, and I'm not saying we shouldn't care about it, we should care about it very much. But if you put that aside analytically, the Israelis have decimated the Iranian, what the Iranians call the axis of resistance. So they've smashed Hamas's military capabilities. Doesn't mean that there aren't still remnants of Hamas. It doesn't mean that the IDF won't be in Gaza for a while. But they have smashed Hamas as a beachhead for the Iranians in Gaza. More consequentially, they have decimated Hezbollah, the most capable paramilitary force in the world. And I think none of us expected. I mean, in Gaza, they fought the war they weren't planning to fight. In Lebanon, they fought exactly the war that they've been planning to fight since 2006, and they pulled it off like chef's kiss. Uh, whether it was, the pager attacks that set in motion a series of decapitation strikes that culminated in Nasrallah, and then everybody who was coming in after him getting killed, wiping out the weapons storage facilities because nobody was delegated the authority to launch those systems, knocking Hezbollah back, a decade or more in capabilities. And then what happened in Syria, which was largely a byproduct of the fact that Assad was propped up by a combination of Russia, which is distracted in Ukraine, Iran, which is back on its heels, and Hezbollah, that had been kind of the steel rods and the concrete of the otherwise brittle Syrian army, and the regime shattered. And now the Israelis have done something like 500 airstrikes in the last couple of days. Not, they've hit a couple of chemical weapons facilities, but largely they're going after anything that's left in the Syrian army that could potentially pose a strategic threat and or to Israel, either because it falls in the hands of extremist groups in Syria or makes its way into Lebanon. They're wiping all of that out. And so the ability of Iran to rebuild its network into the Levant by recent events is has been hugely eroded. Now they still have some prominent proxies left. I expect them to double down on their efforts in Iraq, for example. And the Houthis have shown that a ragtag band of misfits can shut off one of the most important sea lanes in the world. So we shouldn't pretend that there aren't still meaningful proxies out there. But Iran's strategic position has been really, really thrown back, and it's also revealed that as hard as their strategy has been to deal with over the last decades, there's also a degree of fragility to it. So, for example, I do believe that the Iranians contemplated sending regular forces or IRGC forces to help Assad. And the Israelis said, yeah, if you do that, we'll shoot down the planes. And the Iranians didn't do it. And that's because the Iranians can't project power in a traditional, conventional way. That's just not how they do. That's not how they do things. And they weren't able to do things. And so they are back on their heels. So the question then for the Trump administration is, what is the opportunity in that? I think that the Trump administration will be chock-a-block with Iran hawks. That was true in the first, but they won't all have the same objectives. I do think that there will be a fair number of regime changers or regime imploders, because regime change is a bad, that basically says, you know, the regime in Tehran is on the ropes. Let's pound it to the mat economically, greenlighting whatever the Israelis want to do in terms of military pressure. Khamenei is sick, and there's likely to be a leadership transition. Like it's a house of cards that could collapse, just like the one in Damascus. Now I've heard that story a million times before, and it's not happened, but it doesn't mean it's not possible. It just hasn't happened. And so their goal will basically be to use maximum pressure to drive the regime into oblivion. There will be another set that will agree on the maximum pressure, but will look for a way to cut a deal, perhaps along the lines of what Pompeo outlined in 2018. Although I think that deal is still more maximalist than this regime in Tehran could accept. So substantial rollback on the nuclear file plus a bunch of concessions regionally. So we'll see. I think there will be a big debate there. There will also be debate in Tehran, though, because having seen its forward deterrent and retaliatory capability destroyed in Lebanon and in Gaza, there are hardline voices in Iran as we speak who are calling for the weaponization of their threshold nuclear capability. Arguing that Khamenei should overturn his 2003 fatwa against nuclear weapons, and it's not really real, but it's got symbolic importance. And that they should build up a nuclear deterrent as the ultimate safeguard. Now, that would be a pretty risky thing for them to do, because even though they could at least create the fissile material for a few bombs in relatively short order, the Israeli strikes on Iran have completely depantsed the Iranian air defense network. And so some combination of the Israelis and the Americans could do pretty significant and prompt damage. So that's a big decision that the Iranians have to make. What I'll be looking for is whether there's some regional architecture that can be created in the next 4 years based on this kind of tectonic shift. I think the old school version of this is that, with Islamist groups in Syria, like you saw in the Arab Spring, and Iran looming, you will essentially get a grand counterbalancing coalition that's Israel and the Abraham Accord states plus Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Jordan against Iran. I think that is possible. It's also possible, though, that it becomes a bridge too far until the Palestinian issue is resolved in a way that I don't think the current government in Israel can resolve it. And I don't think Trump will push for it, but you never know. Another version of this is that you get a regional de-escalation and accommodation where it's less of two camps, but more an Israeli side, an Iranian side, and some countries in the middle that have very good relations with both sides. And so this is already the play that the Emiratis have been playing between Iran and Israel. But I could see the Saudis taking a similar middle person approach. And then you have countries like Qatar and Oman and Iraq. So you have a bunch of swing states in the middle that are basically trying to be buffers between these two sides without going all in. But that for the moment, all sides have an incentive to kind of calm down. And that would be a very different regional arrangement than this kind of like these blocks that I think other folks imagine.
Fascinating. I have many more questions I could ask you, but I know my colleagues in the room probably have even more. So please raise your hand. Raise it a little bit higher than even normal, because I'm sitting a little bit lower than normal. And so I see Elizabeth Wood. Go ahead, and then everyone else, keep your hands up.
You didn't mention Turkey. How is Turkey going to? I think Turkey's going to take advantage of this shifting power relations. I'd be very curious to hear about that.
Yeah, it's so. I think the perception that the big winners coming out of the big loser was Iran, and the big winners were some combination of Turkey and Israel, essentially. Israel's a little mixed because they are concerned about the Islamist coalition that's come forward. We'll have to wait and see on Turkey. I think HTS, which is the Al Qaeda offshoot that has or hasn't become more moderate over time, does have a relationship with Turkey, but Turkey has a lot of other Sunni opposition groups that they've been backing in the north, so the SNA and the FSA and others. So I think we'll have to see how the competition among those groups plays out. The thing in the near term that I think is more concerning is that how much does Turkey believe they have to move into the north to prevent the Kurds that are aligned with the United States, we call them the Syrian Democratic Forces, the bulk of which are the YPG, which the Turks see as the PKK, and they've consistently backed Syrian opposition groups in the north to expand a buffer zone in the north. We've already seen some exchanges of territory. I think even in the last 24 hours, there's been some back and forth in the city of Manbij, which is a strategically important city in the north. I think you're going to see a lot of that. And the real question is, do the Turks feel like they need to move in to create a buffer zone in the north? Not unlike this, the Israelis are moving in to create a buffer zone in the south. So while I think you're going to see, I don't mean this to trivialize it, but two games. The one is the inside game of who's going to govern Syria and on what terms, and the other is the outside game of how aggressive are outside actors in carving up parts of Syria to create buffer zones against whatever may happen. I'm more confident in the second than I am in the
Well, it
first.
may not just be Syria, right? If Iran is weakened, then Turkey becomes a bigger hegemon.
Yeah, maybe. But their ability to, I mean, the Iranians were able to exert a degree of indirect influence because of a proxy network that the Turks don't have. So there's no question that Turkey will have more influence in the region than it had before the fall of Assad and the weakening of Iran. But I think they are only one of the major players at the table, not the major player at the
But
table.
there's still Azerbaijan, bigger. Elsa.
Caitlin.
Thanks. This is fascinating. I was going to ask you about Iran, but since you went through my entire list of possible points and questions, I'll the U.S. nuclear policy. So, as you obviously know, and people who follow it, there was this I found kind of surprising Strategic Posture Commission report that came out. When I saw the list of commissioners, I was like, they're not even going to be able to write a report and reach consensus. But they did reach consensus, and the consensus is basically that there's a lot of recommendations, but pushing in the direction that U.S. nuclear forces are probably not adequately sized and shaped for the emerging threat environment. And there's recommendations for kind of short-term changes to legacy forces, as well as serious reconsideration of the one-to-one program of record on nuclear modernization for future forces. My question is, do you think that the incoming administration is going to act on some of these recommendations in ways that are appreciably different from what otherwise would have occurred had the election gone the other way? In other words, where is this going? And is it actually that different from what it would have been otherwise?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, to state the obvious, it's too soon to tell. I don't know that it's going to be hugely different. I honestly think had Harris won, there would have been a lot of pressure to increase the defense budget and not just in the nuclear issue, but across the board. She also didn't have quite the same set of priors on the nuclear stuff that Biden did. But I think more importantly, like the world is just a harder place, right? So arms control regimes are in tatters. The relationship with Russia is such that it's hard to predict whether New START can be extended again, let alone built upon with new agreements. China has no interest in arms control of any kind until they reach parity, and even after that, it's not clear because there's not a clear history of that. And you've got a three-body problem now on the nuclear issue, where the Chinese are rushing to 1,000 to 1,500 strategic nuclear weapons over the next 10 years. So that's a big deal. I think there will be an impetus in the Trump administration to fully fund the current program of record. I expect that they will turn back on and make real SLICM-N, the sea launch cruise missile that has a lower yield. Because people make the argument that unlike in Europe where we might have more viable lower yield options, we don't really have the same set of options in the Pacific. But I think they're going to face a lot of the same constraints that the Biden administration faced and that Harris constraints faced, which is this stuff is really expensive. All right, I'll just give you an example. SLICM-N, for what we can debate about its value or not. Like, I think it is marginally valuable, but is it worth the cost? I don't know. But I'll tell you what the cost is. It's like $30 billion. $30 billion is a lot of conventional capability, or a lot of capability in cyber defenses against what China plans to do against our critical infrastructure, or a lot of resilience efforts in space against what China plans to do against our space architecture, or just conventional modernization across the board. Like $30 billion is not a small amount. Oh, and by the way, you're also going to put these missiles on the same submarines that you're going to want to launch conventional cruise missiles for. They're actually more important for the China fight. So it's just that there's trade-offs. And like, I didn't get the sense that like the Air Force and the Navy, who are the biggest bill payers on all of this, are like, let's spend a lot more on nuclear weapons. So I think when the budget implications become clear, there will be a ceiling on what is viable. I'll also say there's clearly a debate within Trump world about where the defense budget should be. I don't know if any of you read the Robert O'Brien Foreign Affairs article that he wrote over the summer, Peace Through Strength, which was laying out Trump's foreign policy in a second term. It basically said, like, here are the 6 different things we should do to modernize the U.S. military, and then it said, but we need to do it all with a flat defense budget, right? Which, like, I'm sorry, you're not going to squeeze. Not even Doge will be able to identify enough savings for Slickerman and all these other things. So I think that it's just, the reality is that the defense budget's going to go up, but there's a lot of investments that have to be made that are like big generational investments in our defense industrial base and in modernizing the conventional force and transitioning it that are going to compete with nuclear. I will say the one piece of logic that even in a world where we, I come to this grudgingly, where we can admit that the salience of nuclear weapons is higher than we had hoped a decade ago, and that our current stockpile may not be sufficient in that world. We do have to resist a logic that you hear in Washington, which is what I call the boy who dies with the most toys wins, right? Which is that if Russia has 4,000 nuclear weapons and China has 1,500, like we need 5,501 or we lose, which is stupid. It's stupid in every way that you can be stupid. And yet there are lots of people who make that argument. So I think the key theoretical question is, what would be required to credibly deter in the context of a conventional conflict with one of these powers, while having enough in reserve to create unacceptable damage on a third party? Not because, like, honestly, if the big nuclear war happens, like, it doesn't matter how many nuclear weapons you have left over, they're not going to be used. We're all going to be dead. But the point is, really, in a conventional conflict with a major power, what would the residual need to be that would hold at risk a set of targets that the other side would see as unacceptable? And what is that? And people should debate what types of targets are they. Is it counterforce? Is it countervalue? Is it command and control? Like, how do you do that consistent with the laws of war? Is that even possible? Like, there's a whole bunch of but those are the questions that should be asked, which is how to create some margin of unacceptable damage in this 3-body world.
Great. Nick.
Thank you very much for the talk. I'm going to tell one of the military calls. In 2022 and 2023 and 2024, we saw an evolution of policy on responsible use of artificial intelligence. Now, the policy and framework guidance that came out was very, other than the carve out for high impact implementation, it was very open. How do you see the policy environment changing over the next year or two as we get into this multipolar end body problem, if we throw the corporations in there as well, changing the geopolitics?
Yeah, it's a good question. Look, I think to some degree you will see a continuation. You may see an acceleration in the Trump administration as a byproduct of 2 things. One is, I just think a general view that we are racing with China on AI, especially to the frontier, and that we need to take more risk on the innovation side, even if it accepts more risk on the safety side. And now, whether that can push really big bureaucracies to make really hard changes, I don't know. But I think you will see some evidence there. And then you also just the personalities involved, who are, a lot more folks who are from the tech world. And so I think there will be an acceleration, whether it's from like 60 miles an hour to 100 miles an hour or 60 miles an hour to 75. I mean, there will be some acceleration. But I think what will be important to watch is kind of two different types of debates around AI and national security in the Trump administration. The first is really about this question about the race to the outer frontier. That is really the race to artificial general intelligence, and people can debate about what that term even means or whether it's possible or not. A lot of the frontier AI companies believe that some version of AGI is within a couple of years, or something that the next administration will deal with. Now, what are we talking about? You know, models that are as intelligent as the smartest humans across a whole range of cognitive tasks and economically valuable tasks, but in particular across STEM fields, right? So think of a model that was the equivalent of 1 million of the best scientists in the world, except they weren't just the best scientists in one thing, they were the best scientists in all the things, and they were able to seamlessly collaborate with one another at machine speed without ever sleeping, right? Like, actually, that type of model is completely conceivable in the next 2 to 5 years. Now, if one's view of artificial intelligence is like Skynet or HAL 9000 or the Cylons or Scarlett Johansson's Samantha and Her, we're probably not as close to that, for better or worse. But I think there will be a racing dynamic on the AGI issue, and that has all sorts of national security implications, really from a sense of kind of broader dynamics around economic competitiveness, the military balance, huge breakthroughs in science and technology that might have military applications, those types of things. And I think we will see a lot of focus on that issue, and especially solving some of the infrastructure challenges that are associated with creating AGI, which requires enormous data centers that consume enormous amounts of power. So where do those data centers live? What chips can be put in them, and how are they powered are huge decisions this administration is going to have to deal with. That's the AGI bucket. But the other bucket is just the acceleration of what's going on now. Most artificial intelligence applications are going in the military don't have anything to do with what I just talked about. We are already seeing classification models being used extensively. Classification models are the same types of models that allow an algorithm to determine that's a cat and that's a dog and that's an apple and that's can say that's a tank or that's a radar, using satellite imagery, full motion video, electronic signatures, and can kind of classify objects. There are AI big data analytic tools, predictive analytic tools that also help you create that single pane of glass of taking things that's like, well, you don't know from the picture that it's 100% of a tank, but if you correlate that with 1,000 other things that are going on in the environment, you can be pretty sure that's a tank or a particular type of radar or something else. And so it's drawing connections and correlations, statistical patterns that a human analyst might not be able to see to create a much better situational awareness of the battlefield. So you sometimes hear from our combatant commanders this dream of a single pane of glass, right? That is all the bad guys and all of us, and you can see it all in real time. And honestly, systems like Maven are producing versions of this that are being, that are used in places like Ukraine or in the Red Sea and other. That's already happening. Then you have the generative AI revolution, which is really, I think, a revolution of thinking about human-machine teaming, whereby you can ask the algorithm to provide novel outputs based on natural language, and those outputs can come in the form of language, it can come in the form of code, it can form the video, images, and the multimodality of it. But really, the breakthrough from a military perspective is the ability to interface with the AI essentially as an agent. So I can imagine a command commander who has their JAG and their operations officer and their intel officer and their AI advisor. And like that, we're not too far away from a version of that. And then the last type of models are these autonomy models, which we are already seeing applied in uncrewed systems, and we're likely to see even more, especially because one of the lessons from Ukraine is how contested the environment is becoming from a reliable communications and targeting perspective. And so because of the amount of electronic jamming that's happening, you cannot reliably have a human controller operate these systems. And so that's going to put a lot of pressure on semi-autonomous and autonomous systems. Now, they may be geofenced and have all sorts of constraints on them. So don't think about this as like, the Terminator robots, but some accelerated version of what we're already seeing on the battlefield in Ukraine. So none of that is about AGI. All of that are about AI models that are already part of battle management and intelligence programs, and increasingly embodied in robots. And I think we will see more and more of that, hopefully continuing to be driven by the ethical principles at the heart of the DoD directive that I'm glad to say my office oversaw the writing of when I was at DoD.
It'll be interesting for the race for norms of escalation dynamics with that as well.
Well, these are broader. There are a broader set of. I mean, there are a broader set of strategic stability questions around. If you have perfect situational awareness, including of targets that have previously been very difficult to keep custody of. So think about mobile missiles or submarines, maybe certain aspects of air defense systems, certain aspects of space and cyber command and control architectures. Your ability to keep custody of those targets and strike them promptly, will raise concerns, I think, about first strike instability. I don't think we're at the precipice of that, but it is, I think the Chinese and the Russians to some degree already believe the United States has some degree of conventional first strike capability against them. And I think AI is likely to make that set of concerns worse.
Hanoi.
Sure. Thanks very much for your magisterial take on broad trends in international affairs, as well as drilling down on AI. What I want to do is return to the earlier part of your talk, much as I'd like to spend the next 20 minutes on AI. But you referred to changes in technology, AI, bio, and cyber, and others as well. We could have done a standard list. And you talked about that in terms of its influence and effects on world politics, referencing Nye and Cohen implicitly. Referencing them because you were talking about how this is a space that is dominated by transnational actors and forces, oligarchs, many of whom live very close to Stanford, and others live close to MIT.
Some live close to both.
Private actors are the drivers of many of the changes that you're referencing. On the other hand, you lived in Washington. And during your time in Washington, concerns over US-China rivalry in each of these areas became dominant. And the solutions were classic state-centric solutions. Okay, techno-industrial policy, be it chips in science, ARPA-H, or the Inflation Reduction Act, intended to affect the distribution of capabilities in the US and China particularly, and more broadly. My question to you is this: if we sit back and look ahead 10 years, and I'm again asking you to go back to your visionary mode, what do you expect things to be in 10 years? Do you expect tamed techno-oligarchs to be sitting there coming out of the Trump administration? Or do you expect to see a resurrection of, if you will, traditional Gilpinian realist concerns? Or will, in fact, international relations in the realm of advanced technologies look very, very different? Very, very different in the same way that Nye and Cohen were talking about back in 1975. But I am asking an unfair question. Any one of those would be adequate. But stepping back, what do you think that we're going? Is it going to be looking like a restructured world with politics reorganized? Again, we could talk the particulars on the politics, but I'm interested here in who has power and how these areas will be governed.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, as you would recognize, and most people, this is obviously isn't the first era in which big private companies have had enormous power, right? We can think of the British and Dutch East India companies, or the global oil companies, or other large multinational corporations. I do think what is meaningfully different right now is that these companies are simultaneously at the frontier of the innovation that is increasingly central to national security and economic competitiveness, and that they have near sovereign control over domains that are fundamentally underregulated, but nevertheless are the domains through which we exercise influence and live our lives, right? And like that strikes me as fundamentally different than in the past. I think there will be huge debates, rock'em sock'em debates inside the Trump administration on these questions, because you will have a what I would call the kind of the little tech crowd that there's plenty of money in little tech. It's just like, why invest in Anduril when you can invest in the next Anduril? It's the little tech crowd that wants to disrupt and generate as much innovation and money, frankly, for investors by moving away from the big tech companies, the Googles and Amazons and Microsofts, and letting 1,000 flowers bloom and race in that direction. And that will be, I think, very resonant with the kind of deregulatory bent that the Trump administration is going to have across the board of trying to unleash American business and capital to do amazing things. But I think on the other side, especially in the area of AI, you have a lot of folks around Trump who are talking about a Manhattan Project for AGI. It was one of the major recommendations in the China Commission report, and a lot of the folks who were working on technology policy in the Trump administration, or who are likely to, I think, will be of that bent. So I think there will be because that leads you to a much more heavy-handed government approach. I mean, in the extreme version of the actual Manhattan Project would be a nationalization, which I don't see is in the cards. But there are models of public-private partnership here that would be quite robust. And you could have some of these partnerships being driven by companies who want to do it, and some of the companies who are voluntold to do it. The government has a lot of cards to play. First of all, a lot of the tools that you mentioned of industrial policy create real constraints on these companies despite their global reach, right? Microsoft actually can't build a data center, at least not with 100,000 NVIDIA GPUs in it, anywhere they want, because the Commerce Department won't let them.
Correct.
Right. So that's a pretty big, we can't tell them where to build it, but we can tell them where not to build it, which is why you don't have the types of clusters being built in Abu Dhabi right now that Mohammed bin Zayed and TBZ would like because of those constraints. Increasingly, what a lever the government's going to be able to play is on energy, because none of these AI advances are possible without scaling in ways that are going to create data centers that consume between 1 and 5 gigawatts of power per data center. 1 gigawatt of power is like Miami for a single data center. And so the companies can't achieve that amount of build out without the federal government and state and local governments cutting a lot of red tape and doing a lot of and greasing the skids. So there's a lot of levers here, and I think the Trump administration, and I think they should have this conversation of, if we are going to collaborate with the private sector to scale the compute build outs that are required for AI, what do we get in exchange? Here are the things I would ask. I would ask for the facilities to be built to a level of cyber and physical security that is equivalent to the geopolitical importance of these data centers. And that's a much higher level of physical and cybersecurity and insider threat security than currently exists. I would also ask that a certain percentage of that compute capacity is reserved for the federal government to test the models, but also, frankly, to do classified work on the models to understand the national security implications of the models. And there's a bunch of other things that could be done. Anyway, a public-private partnership like that is perfectly possible. I think it might have happened under Harris too. It could happen under Trump. It's not really the Manhattan Project. It's more kind of like Bell Labs than the Manhattan Project. But the real question mark for me is, will the companies play? Because you've seen recent announcements like Anthropic's partnership with Palantir and OpenAI's partnerships with Anduril, and there's a lot of buy-in at the C-suite level and a lot of disgruntled engineers who aren't really keen on playing this type of role. And frankly, the politics of that with Trump are even more fraught for a lot of the workforce. So, sorry, last point I will make. I think that there will be some degree of public-private partnership, at least among a coalition of the willing. I wouldn't be surprised if Elon Musk jujitsus his current status as first bro to position XAI, which is not at the frontier but is building out compute capacity like gangbusters, to be an early partner of choice for the Trump administration on some of these projects. But I would not expect like a huge national endeavor along the lines of the Manhattan Project unless a war happens that forces us to consolidate production in a way that we haven't seen since World War II, or you get a technological breakthrough on AGI that people recognize as a technological breakthrough. So anyway, you've wanted to jump in about 4 times.
No, I got a long list, Kat. I'm sorry. I just want to try to get to everybody. Even though we could go on forever on any of these.
I'll try to keep my answers short too.
No, they're good answers. Reed.
All right, thanks.
Reed,
Good to see you.
I see you've made something of yourself since you left CSAT. Yeah, cool.
Well, I mean, he did come from MIT, so I mean, let's get the record straight.
Boring question. fortunately or unfortunately, not about a particular technology or region, but I think you're the right person to really shed some light on it, because going back to where the conversation started, you lived process every day while you were in all of the roles you described. And we are about to, in my opinion, but I'd love to hear yours, have a government in which that process is diminished. So the question is about what's the important process? It's supposed to weed out bad ideas, get everyone on the same page for implementation, think about contingencies. My sense is that in Trump 1, there was a diminish of that process over time. There was different principles that were trying to implement it in the beginning, and as they went away, you got the policy entrepreneurs with their window to brief the president an idea and then come out of the office with the signed memo to say we're going to exit Afghanistan in 6 weeks or whatever that's it. What are the risks of that in Trump 2? Do you expect that to happen again? Are they going to come in with no process at the beginning, or is it the kind of thing that's going to diminish over time? What are the risks of a government without process? Is it possible to sustain process when you have really intense controversies going on, like a purge, maybe really intense civil-military relations in the building? And at what level of the government can that process sort of chug along, assistant secretary or below, let's say, and it not actually worry you? That no, Trump 2.0 won't really concern themselves with the details at some level of the surface of the government and below, and so the process will continue without all those attendant risks.
Yeah, lots of questions in there. Let me put it this way. I think process matters for all the reasons that you stated. The world is hard. You need to bring a lot of expertise to bear. Also, if you don't get buy-in from agencies and departments, it's actually hard to implement things. You start to create a lot of antibodies. Your ability to be effective is diminished. So there's a million reasons why process matters. It always has. Now, the reality is, since the George W. Bush administration, we've seen an increasing concentration of decision-making at the White House. That was going to happen. That happens in any second term, and so that's going to happen with in Trump 2.0, which is his really think about it as their second term, and I think the power will be concentrated in the White House. And I think obviously, whatever one thinks of his cabinet picks, they're all over the place for sure. Ideologically, each one of them represents kind of a slice of Trump's own heterodox views of the world. But the one litmus test for all of them is loyalty. And I actually don't think any of the ideas are going to be coming from the departments. I think almost all the ideas are going to be coming from the White House. And that the most experienced folks of the Trump administration will probably be those who served with Trump in the first term, who find themselves back at the White House, and that they will be driving things. I think there will be process, but processes for those who've served in government, sometimes stuff bubbles up from the bottom, and other times you have a director from the top where the process is used to then execute. Right? During Trump 1.0, you had H.R. McMaster, who tried to run a totally normal NSC process that was constantly thwarted by the last 50 feet between the National Security's office and the Oval Office. You then had John Bolton, who ran pretty much no process, but also basically wanted to run his own plays that the president may or may not have been aware of. And then you had Robert O'Brien, who tried to run a process in service of whatever Trump tweeted that morning. Right? Very different models for a national security advisor. I think Mike Waltz is likely to be more in the latter category, that runs a process that's oriented around driving the agencies and departments to do what the president wants them to do, and using the fact that across the board, whoever gets through the nomination process will be loyal to have those folks be enforcers in their own buildings for executing what the president wants to do. That's just a prediction. Who knows? That doesn't mean there won't be real fights. I think there will be big fights over Iran, big fights over China, big fights there are. But I think this is going to be a very White House centric view. The thing I worry the most about, well, you can worry about if you don't like what the president's doing, then you don't like that model because he's driving us in a direction you don't like. I'll leave it to you all to judge whether you like that or not. I worry very much about the hollowing out of the middle of our bureaucracies. The two things that worry me the most from a democratic resilience perspective of a second term in the Trump administration. One is just kind of the institutional checks and balances on executive power, and does Congress play its role? Does courts play its role? Is the media allowed to play its role? Does civil protest and debate, like, is that still a thing in our democracy? Like that the resiliency of that matters. But the other piece is the resilience of our federal workforce, right? I think that Musk and Ramaswamy, frankly, I don't think they're going to come up with ideas to get $2 trillion from anywhere, but they could come up with a bunch of ideas that fire people and or encourage them to leave, right? So you put a bunch of agencies and departments out of DC into Idaho or Oklahoma or West Virginia or whatever, and you say, oh, you continue to work there, and then most people don't because they don't want to move. That's a way, right? So you move the EPA to Texas or whatever they end up doing, or they're going to make everybody come into work. And not do remote work, which was a thing before COVID. It's been accelerated, and a lot of people will quit that way. Or they do the executive order and do Schedule F, and they basically find everybody who's an SES level or a GS-15 and fire them all and replace them with mid-level politicals, and that leads to an exodus among the rank and file. And then you layer on top of that the possibility for turmoil in civil military relations. If you go after the brass at the very top for being too woke. And you create other drama around other issues, I do worry that what just makes the trains run on time in our government, as inefficient as it is, could just break down. And I remember, coming in at the beginning of the Biden administration, where we were coming out of what we perceived to be the chaos of the first Trump administration and COVID, of how hollowed out the Pentagon felt on the civilian side. Now, a lot of that vacuum was filled by the military side, for better or worse, but it was really, really hollowed out. It will be worse the next time if my predictions come. And at a certain point, like, it's actually hard to be a superpower if your government doesn't function. And it goes back to Ken's point a little bit. Part of, like, how do you predict the future about which actors are going to be most powerful is the relative power between them, right? And if most of the innovation and the dynamism is happening out of the U.S. government, while you're also destroying the U.S. government, then it tilts the playing field even more. So that's the thing. So I would expect that we have a lot of fire and fury that's concentrated out of the White House and directed down at the agencies and departments, and that loyal lieutenants will try to bend these places to their will, and we'll see a lot of rank and file leave. But otherwise, it'll be great.
On that cheery note, we'll go to our next question. Eric Higginbotham.
Great. Well, thank you very much. It's a fantastic talk, and I'm super impressed at your ability to take this wide range of questions and answer them so well. But I want to return to a somewhat historical topic and the Ukraine war. You mentioned boiling the frog. The frog now seems pretty well cooked. Ruble's down. Interest rates are 21%. The depots are sort of emptying of tanks. I guess they're 2/3 plus empty now. It's decades of production destroyed. My question, though, is, the analogy or that phrase, boiling the frog, has been used pretty extensively. Usually when it is, it's followed by whether that was intended or not, right? That phrase. So to what extent was it intended? I can imagine independent forces that both constrained U.S. policy that you've already discussed, as well as independent forces that pushed a gradual expansion or a relaxation, rather, of restrictions and ROEs, whether they were the UK's moves or other actors' moves. But to what extent was this conscious? To what extent was it a factor of other forces? And then last sort of question is, if you're boiling the frog, there are really two frogs in the pot there. There's also the Ukrainian frog, and that's pretty well boiled as well. So to what extent, did considerations of the fact that both are going to be subject to the same forces or similar forces weigh?
Sure. So, great question. So whether you take boiling the frog or salami slicing, essentially what we're talking about is incrementalism. And the question is, was incrementalism as a escalation management tool, was that like an intentional thing or a byproduct? And the answer is yes. So there were elements. But there were elements of it that were clearly intentional, right? I can point to specific decisions at specific moments that were influenced by escalation considerations, right? So the early decision not to contemplate a no-fly zone, even though Zelensky was calling for it. The early hesitancy to send a bunch of Soviet-made but NATO aircraft MiGs that were sitting in Poland and elsewhere into Ukraine because it would look like a bunch of NATO aircraft were coming into Ukraine. There were concerns around that. The reluctance about ATACMS, providing ATACMS and Storm Shadow and Scalp and other things. I think escalation concerns did weigh in on some of the president's decisions on all of that. So the goal, though, I think, was not to boil the frog, but more it was about probing. It was increment. So it was an acknowledgement that we didn't know exactly where the escalation thresholds were, and so we tread carefully in those areas where, especially the intelligence community suggested these might be red lines or things that would, put Putin in a particular position. Doesn't mean the intel folks are right. It doesn't mean our judgments are right. I just think there were, so you get a degree of incrementalism that's a result essentially of probing for where the threshold in that stability and stability paradox is, of how much room you have to load. And as we got more information, and frankly, because we did it incrementally, the threshold probably moved. Like, I think if we'd done a lot of the stuff that we did at the beginning, it would have been a lot more escalatory than it ended up being. That's a hypothesis. But a lot of that was intentional as an act of probing. But a lot of it was just a byproduct of a bunch of other things bureaucratically that bore on the decisions. So the vast majority of weapon systems that we did not provide to Ukraine in the numbers and were readiness concerns for the U.S. military. Like the Ukrainians burned through 90,000 155 millimeter artillery shells a month. Prior to the war, the United States produced 14,000 155 millimeter artillery shells a month. We now produce about 50,000. We will ramp to 90,000 by the end of next year. But at a certain point, we'll run out of artillery shells that we also need for a North Korean contingency or a bunch of other stuff. And it's even more acute when you're talking about certain classes of munitions like ATACMS, where they're very high value munitions for our contingency plans. We just don't have that many, and we're at a moment of transition to a new missile. The Ukrainians asking for hundreds and hundreds of these things. Well, the answer, the reason why they're not getting thousands of ATACMS is not because of escalation. It's because there aren't thousands of ATACMS, right? So part of this is a readiness issue. Part of it's an absorption issue. At different points in the war, things were not given to the Ukrainians because they weren't trained on them. They couldn't have immediate effectiveness. It would take them a while to be able to absorb them and learn how to maintain them and do all the other things. So we privileged providing Soviet-era equipment at the beginning, and then easier to train on equipment in the middle, and then we built up their combined arms capabilities over time that required more training. And that incrementalism was a byproduct of our judgments about what they could absorb and use and generate effects. And then the last part of incrementalism was that Congress didn't give us unlimited amounts of money. Like, they gave us a lot, but at any moment, I oversaw $43 billion of security packages to Ukraine. Every single drawdown package they went to Ukraine when I was there came through my office before it went to the secretary and the president. Okay, so I know that the choices here, and if you spend $1 billion on one thing, it meant you didn't have the $1 billion for something else. And I'll give you a perfect example. In the first 6 weeks of the war, I think we could probably all agree that the most important period of the entire Ukraine war was the first 6 weeks, because that was the part of the war where the Russians were defeated in achieving their strategic objectives of seizing the whole country and changing the regime. Had they won the Battle of Kyiv, the history of this war would be written entirely different. They didn't. In the 6 weeks of the war, we didn't have $100 billion or $60 billion or $43 billion. We had $3 billion. Okay, so Undersecretary Kahl, what should we spend that $3 billion on? Well, we should give them a Patriot battery because that's what they're asking for. Great, that's $1 billion. And it won't arrive for 10 weeks. They're not trained on them. They don't have enough interceptors, and that's not the real threat they're facing. Or you could spend that $1 billion on Stinger man portable air defense systems and Soviet-era ammunition for their S-300 systems, and. Well, we should give them tanks. Great. They're really expensive, they're hard to maintain, they're not trained on them, it will take them a long time. Or, that'd be another $1 billion, by the way, you give them the Abrams and the Bradleys and the Strykers. Or I could spend $1 billion on Javelin anti-tank systems and artillery shells. You get the point, right? So, a lot of the criticism that's come this way is under this magical thinking that we had unlimited amounts of money, they could all be deployed, that it had zero trade-offs for the U.S. national interests. And the entire narrative out there is that Joe Biden was scared of Vladimir Putin and escalation. And as a result, he didn't provide Ukraine what they needed to win. And in my experience, that's just not how history happened. That there were a very narrow slice of things where this boiling the frog was an intentional strategy to manage escalation. but that was a very narrow slice, and that the vast majority was kind of boring bureaucratic stuff about readiness and training and absorption and all this other stuff. But Politico has a harder time talking about that than the first part.
Politico has a hard time with a lot of things.
For the record, for all those political reporters listening, I love you guys. You guys are great.
Yeah. Well, this has been an absolutely terrific seminar. It's our last of the semester, and to paraphrase, I think it's T.S. Eliot, you've helped us go out with a bang and not a whimper. So thank you very much. Thank you. Great.